So to start, there is an important distinction to know between human rights and international humanitarian law. So human rights is the inalienable fundamental rights to which a person is inherently entitled simply because she or he is a human being. This is from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It applies at all times to all individuals. It is also known as customary international law and is binding on all nations. Although human rights fall short in current times, as we may see through the media, in historical time it has actually never existed. It is a very, very new concept. And in time it will continue to develop. It has only been in existence since 1945, post-World War II, so 65 years old. It was born out of the gross human rights violations of the Holocaust in Hiroshima. So, international humanitarian law, what is it? It is actually the law of armed conflict. It is made up of the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, and subsequent treaties and norms that have become customary law. There are two branches to this law that govern all aspects of armed conflict. Jus in bello in Latin means the right in war, and jus ad bellum means the right to war. So together these laws dictate how to conduct responsibilities and they dictate and conduct responsibilities of following players in relation to each other and protected persons. So the players are belligerent nations, neutral actors, and individuals engaged in warfare. War crimes are a serious violation of these laws. So I'm just going to go over a brief overview of the history of brutality just to give you an impression of how it was before humanitarian law came into existence. The massacre of civilians during armed conflict has a long and dark history. So in the revolt of Spartacus in 71 BC, as you may know, the rebels revolted. Most of them were killed in war but defeated by the Roman legion, but those that survived, they were actually crucified, 6,000 of them, at a rate of 500 a day. And the only reason the legion stopped crucifying at that rate was because they ran out of wood. So then there was the siege of Jerusalem. Crusaders massacred Jews and Muslims. There was the Nanjing Massacre in 1937. Japanese soldiers buried Chinese civilians alive. It was known as the 10,000 corpse ditch, rape, looting, and some 250,000 people died in that war. Then there was the Bosnian War. That was somewhat recent history, 92. And mainly the Serbian forces targeted and raped Bosniak women. An estimated 20,000 to 50,000 were raped. And after this conflict is when rape was included as part of international humanitarian law as a tool of war that should not be used. So humanitarian norms prior to the 19th century. As I said before, human rights started out of 1945, but humanitarian law has it progresses through history. We can see its origins from the beginning of religion and moral ethics. You can see them in the laws of Manu, which is the Hindu direction of how to engage in hand-to-hand combat. In Rome, too, there are, the Roman legion also had some prisoner of war laws, and Islamic law as well, protections of seniors and children. So origins of codified humanitarian norms. As I said, it comes from two historical streams, the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions. They were conferences held in these two cities, and eventually treaties came out of it. It was basically a systematic attempt to limit savagery due to warfare from the 19th century on. It was mainly led by the states that were influenced by the Enlightenment, and these laws started developing at a critical period in European history. Between the two wars, at the fall of the first Napoleon, the rise of the second Napoleon, they didn't want to have as much devastation, so they started putting together rules because it was clear to them that war is inevitable, so might as well make it more humanitarian. Conventions that are significant building blocks. So as I said, these are all the Geneva Conventions. And just briefly, the Geneva Conventions go into the rights of protected persons. Prisoners of war, women, children, and spies. So basically it just is it covers most protected persons, We'll go over the loopholes in a bit. So then there's the Hague Conventions, and the Hague Conventions cover what is banned from use. So what types of weapons cannot be used. For example, bullets cannot enter the body and between two combatant states, there's rules covering them too. So terminology of humanitarian law. Civilians. Civilians are not combatants. They're not legitimate targets of war. Civilian object. Any object that is not a military object, but if it is used to support military action, it becomes a legitimate target of military. And when in doubt, it's always a civilian object. A combatant is a uniformed member of the armed forces. Hors de combat is literally, it means the fight that is, there's an area of war and there's an area that is not of war. So where civilians live, they should, and that's the area where the wounded and captured are taken. And then there are specific protections. Certain categories of people and objects must receive additional protections. Children, women, seniors. The International Committee of the Red Cross also has protections because they go in and save the wounded, heal the wounded, and relief personnel. You can't target them, you can't shoot them. So, principles of international humanitarian law. These are the main points that one should not forget. The principle of humanity. Civilians and combatants who are out of the zone of war must be protected and treated humanely. So that is where the prisoners of war idea comes in. Martin's Clause, as I said, this is very important. This came out of the Hague Convention, and it is basically stating if a particular rule is not to be found in treaty law, belligerents remain under protections and authority of customary law. So if someone is not included or not covered, they should always be protected until there's a law that comes in to actually address their specific, I guess, status. Principle of distinction. When planning or carrying out an attack, distinction is crucial. It must be made between civilians and combatants and between civilian objects and military objects. Every possible precaution must be made. Principle of proportionality. The idea of total war after these conventions came into being does not exist anymore. Destruction of enemy grounds must not exceed the actual military strategy or the anticipated advantage. Superfluous injury is unnecessary. So here are the problems with the U.S. application of international humanitarian law. The principle of distinction. In these current wars, what's happened is the idea of out of the zone of war, hors de combat, does not exist. War is fought within the cities. It is harder to make distinctions between civilian homes and non-civilian homes, and a lot of the time, insurgents, for example, launch missiles from civilian homes. So is that a legitimate place to attack, or is it not? A combatant. Also, as I said, a combatant is a uniformed person of the armed forces. However, in these wars, insurgents and terrorists are not uniformed. So it is hard for the military to distinguish from the civilians, and confusions cause a lot of problems. For example, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, the Iraqi National Guard came out en masse and were uniformed, and they confronted the U.S. 400 of those troops in that one day were killed by the U.S. It was a legitimate confrontation, but again, they were dressed in uniform. They never came out dressed again. They never wore their uniform again. So, prisoners of war. Individuals get prisoner of war status if they are uniformed men who are captured by or surrender to the enemy force. Spies, there's actually a clause in the international humanitarian law that covers spies. If a party is caught engaging in espionage, they do not have the right to a prisoner of war status. However, when you have insurgents in these wars, they are not spies, and they are not uniformed combatants. what status do they fit under? That is where the complications in these wars come from. Again, like I said, remember Martin's Clause? If they're not covered, they're still to be treated humanely. International Committee of the Red Cross is also the one that is in charge of supervising the treatment of prisoners of war. And in this current war, as you may have heard, in Guantanamo, the U.S. at first did not allow the Red Cross to enter, and there was a lot of debate about that. And then the Red Cross was eventually allowed to enter, and they concluded that there was insufficient due process in the protection of the rights of persons affected. But they did not necessarily mention that they were being mistreated, because the laws covering prisoners of war are very extensive. All the way from comfort to mental health should be preserved. So anyway, this is a brief overview of humanitarian law, and Josh will reconcile his experiences and the application of international humanitarian law.